Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to Leeds Beckett University Planning School and our webinar this afternoon, Land Ownership and Land Reform, a Community Planning Issue. This is the first in a short series of webinars this autumn in which we're looking at the role of land ownership and land value in housing affordability and development. And we're looking at the issues of land reform and access to land as community planning issues. We have three fantastic speakers for you this afternoon. First of all, Andy Wightman, who has been the trailblazer in mapping land ownership and leading the campaign for land reform. We have Laurie Macfarlane, who has written extensively on the economics of land and housing development. And we have Kate Ashbrook, the General Secretary of the Open Spaces Society, the first national amenity organisation on whose struggles for access to land much of our current planning legislation is still based. Now, before I hand over to the first speakers, I want to introduce our latest community partner, which is the Amenity Organisation for Scotland, Planning Democracy. And I'm going to ask Clare from Planning Democracy to introduce herself and the organisation and its campaigns. Clare, over to you.
Thank you, Quintin. Hello, everybody. My name's Clare Symonds, and I'm the founder and chair of an organisation called Planning Democracy, and we're a grassroots organisation, and we've been working to bring about fairness and equality in for communities in planning since 2009, focused mainly or solely in Scotland. So I guess one of the most intense periods of our work was during the planning reforms of 2015 up here in Scotland, which culminated in the Scotland 2019 Planning Act. And this was the longest debated and most amended piece of legislation since Holyrood began. And I'd like to take a little bit of credit for that, but far more credit should be given to Andy Wightman, who was an MSP at the time and was instrumental in putting forward some of the more potentially transformative amendments, and I believe improved the quality of the debate significantly during that. And Andy, we miss you very much as a politician. You know, I think Holyrood lost a somewhat of an intellectual heavyweight when they lost you. So but since 2019 our work is focused more broadly on land and planning, and so we're not viewing planning as a technical system that regulates the development of land. We're viewing it in a much broader sense, because I suppose we're beginning to recognise that the environmental, social resilience of communities, health, climate, economy, democracy, that's all intertwined and has roots in land, our land system. And we're recognising that, you know, a lot of the cause of society's problems lie in a broken land system. And so we're trying to get our heads around this, trying to understand it and make the links between planning and land use and the power dynamics of land. But the complexity and the opaqueness of much of the topic, we think, allows the problems to persist very much at the convenience of those with power and vested interests. And particularly housing, we found, was one of these. And recently, we've been asking as an organisation who's benefiting from the way we do housing up in Scotland, and we're trying to understand and challenge the current system that seems to prioritise the interests of the market and profit at the expense of society and the environment. So this work, particularly in challenging some of the housing policies in the national planning framework, which was being reviewed, and the Scottish planning policy, led us to Quintin, and we some Quintin's work and papers, and I got in touch with him, and we've been in touch ever since. It also led us to some of Laurie's work and led me to read Laurie's book as well, and indeed I should say some other people such as Bob Colnut, who've helped us to understand this topic, and particularly you know, with Quintin, you've helped us very much to work with politicians and other policymakers to understand the complexities of housing land supply, for example. So we're really grateful to you for this webinar, and to Leeds Beckett for giving us and our network of supporters, who I see a number of them here today, to give time to learn and debate and to meet people from England and from a different sort of area. And Kate, it will be lovely to hear from you too, because we don't know you. So there is a land reform bill, and we're working with colleagues in the Scottish Community Alliance and Community Land Scotland to get a response into this consultation that's currently happening up here around the land reform bill. So if you're interested in getting a response into that yourselves and want to find out more from Planning Democracy and what we're thinking around with our allies in the Community Alliance and so on, please do get in touch. I shall put our email address, info@planningdemocracy.org.uk, into the chat. But if you want to get in touch, you can either go to our website, and I'll put that up, planningdemocracy.org.uk, or just put a note in the chat and send me a question or whatever. So thank you for giving me time to introduce my wee organisation.
You're very welcome, Claire. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much. Okay, so can I hand over at this point to Andy Wightman? Andy, can we have you and your slides, if possible? That'd be brilliant.
Right, thanks very much, Quintin. Thanks for the invitation to be along here tonight. My name's Andy Wightman. I'm a self-employed researcher and writer on land issues, have been since 1994 or so. As Claire mentioned, I was a member of the Scottish Parliament for 5 years, from 2016 to 2021. So what I want to do is just kind of introduce the question of land ownership or land governance, to give it its broader title, and just to basically stimulate you to think about why and how this matters. It sits beneath almost everything else. It's deeply rooted in history. It's difficult to change, and yet it does lie at the root of many of the issues we have when it comes to land use and land use planning. So I thought I'd just start by kind of clarifying some terminology. So you can basically break down this topic of land governance into 4 elements. You have land tenure, which is basically the rules, the legal rules surrounding how people can own rights to land. That might be land ownership, or it might be tenancies. So that's basically the rules. Land ownership then is what emerges from that: the who owns, the pattern of ownership, the type of owner, and they all enjoy rights defined by the tenure system. But of course, who they are and the pattern of ownership is in itself, as will become clear later, very much a product of social, economic and historical forces. Then you have land use, and that's how land is used in large measure. And then you have land reform, which is basically the process, and I'll touch on this at the end, the process of changing the relationship between society and land. And you can think of this in terms of power, if you like. Land tenure is the nature of power, how that power is defined. Land ownership is about who has that power, how it's distributed. Land use is about how that power is exercised, and land reform is about changing, fundamentally in many cases, those power structures. And it's worth remembering as well that land is something that is dry. So this map of Scotland, obviously the dry land of Scotland is land, but land can also be wet. The oceans are part of land in a legal sense. So if you can see the faint white lines about 12 miles off the coast of Scotland, they carry down over the coast of England and Wales, Northern Ireland as well. Those are territorial waters, so those are legally part of Scotland, legally part of the state of the United Kingdom. And then you have the yellow areas, which are the sea areas, which are not owned, but there are exclusive economic rights in them. It's an exclusive economic zone, so the right to drill for hydrocarbons, etc., fishery rights are all defined by those exclusive economic zones. And then beyond that, you have the high seas, and the high seas are, I think there's currently a conference trying to update the UN Convention on the High Seas, and that governs the rights to the high seas. So land and land rights are something that are universal. They also go up and down. If you own land to the centre of the earth and up to the heavens above. So it's literally a framework of governance that, in one way or another, covers the whole of planet Earth. Also actually touches on outer space, but that's a topic for another day. I came into this whole debate because I was a student studying forestry at the University of Aberdeen in the 1980s. And during that time, there was a huge controversy emerged over planting exotic conifer plantations in the so-called flow country, the deep peatlands of Caithness and Sutherland in the far north of Scotland. And this was being driven by tax concessions, tax breaks to investors. You had celebrities like snooker players and football players and television personalities like Terry Wogan were buying land here and planting trees. We're now taking all these trees out. This is a huge repository of carbon, very, very valuable habitat, and should never have been planted in the first place. But I began to get interested in land and land governance during this time, because it was clear to me that this was a bad thing to do. It was the wrong thing to do. It was also intriguing as to why, if you did want to plant trees in this part of the world, you would ask people in London to do it rather than the people who already owned this land. And then, reading further, this whole question is deeply historically imbued. This is actually the golf courses at St Andrews, the famous golf course at St Andrews. That's part of the common lands of St Andrews, has been since the 15th century. This is an engraving taken during the time of the so-called Rabbit Wars, when the town of St Andrews, the royal borough, was got into financial difficulties and leased it out to some rabbit farmers. People ate rabbits in those days, and they were the rabbits, of course, dug holes and created new bunkers, and there was a war broke out between golfers and the rabbit wardens. Went to the House of Lords and all the rest of it. So everywhere you go, there's a story to be told about land. Now, politically, this is very salient as well, and I think Laurie will talk a little bit about this. This was Gordon Brown, the Chancellor, in 1997. In his first budget, "I will not allow house prices to get out of control," he said. This was another Chancellor, George Osborne, went to Dublin just before the financial crash, said that Ireland stands as a shining example of the art of the possible in long-term economic policy making. How wrong was he? Ireland crashed and burned. That's a quote from the Financial Times. At the height of the lunacy, around 3/4 of the total lending by Irish banks, 420 billion euros, 2.5 times the size of the economy, got bound up in property construction and land speculation, a sort of Northern Rock on steroids. So this is what can happen when you don't get your land policy right. If you essentially allow people to speculate on land, to lend on land, to borrow secured against land, this is what can happen, amongst many other things. And if you look at, for example, the cost of housing in the United Kingdom, this is a bit of a dated slide, apologies, but you find that the biggest contributor to the cost of housing is not the cost of building houses, it's not the earnings of those who build them, it's actually land prices. And I think Laurie will be going into a little bit more detail on that. And one of the reasons why the United Kingdom is such a strange place when it comes to housing is that, in contrast to most countries in continental Europe, where typically over 50%, well over 50% in many cases of housing is self-built, and it's not actually built by the people who own the house, it's self-procured. In other words, people who want a house will go out and procure a house and it will be built for them. So they're in control right from the outset, and it's led to a very, very competitive design and build market in continental Europe that's pushed up quality because people are in there, the people that are going to own this expensive asset are in there at the beginning, essentially demanding the best. In the UK, by contrast, I don't know, can't remember the figures are, but over 90% of new housing is built by speculative volume builders. So they build it with no buyer, they just build it hoping someone will buy it, and they build it in huge volume. And this is unique in continental Europe. And it also means that they compete for land. So in this slide here, developer 2 gets the land because they paid more than developer 1. The problem with that is you can only sell housing into the market at, broadly speaking, the local market rates. And so the end price for these houses is going to be, broadly speaking, the same. But if you've paid more for your land, you have to cut costs. And so building quality suffers, affordability and infrastructure provision suffers, profit tends not to suffer. And this is one of the features of the way we build houses, and it's intimately tied to land. It's one of the reasons, for example, when you look at residential property, comparing Germany with the UK, for example, German house prices indexed for inflation have remained broadly constant for 40 years, whereas UK house prices have been on an inexorable rise. It's one of the reasons as well why German housing is very high quality, because they spend money on quality. They don't spend money on land. So just a few other little observations about why land is important. This was a very big fire in a building in Glasgow about 10 years ago. It was an empty industrial building. It's the biggest fire in Glasgow, I think, for 40 years. It was a huge conflagration. And I'm a bit of a geek and a nerd, and so I wondered who owns this building, and found out that it was owned by a property development company based in Belfast. They'd bought it 10 years previously. They'd done nothing with it. Due to the way that we frame tax policy, non-domestic rates, so that's the recurrent tax paid by the occupiers of non-residential property, there's 100% exemption on empty industrial property. So this, the owner of this building was paying no local taxes whatsoever, and yet still expected the fire brigade to come out and put out the fire, still expected the police to maintain public order, still expected the courts to be available there to pursue any claims of liability, insurance disputes or whatever. And ultimately, those who own land and property depend on the state, depend on the armed forces to defend the country if it's invaded, and therefore defend the value and literally their own property and land. So there's an important link between the ownership of property and land and an obligation to contribute towards the costs of running the country, because many of the costs of running the country are there to protect property. In fact, if you look at the legal history of property and law, you will find that vast amounts of law in the past have been designed to protect private property interests. So that's just a small example of how, for example, tax policy interacts with the ownership of land. Another example is this. In fact, I've just done a soft launch of a website called whoownscotland.org.uk. There'll be a link at the end, which I started back in the 90s, or early noughties rather, but it gone to abeyance and I'm just starting up again. And a number of years ago, I was investigating Danish landowners in Scotland, Danish landowners in the UK, and I noted that the Danish tax authorities were mounting a campaign to persuade Danish citizens who owned land outside Denmark to register it and pay taxes. So Denmark has a series of land taxes which is levied on Danish property and collected on Danish property. But of course, Danish citizens, like the citizens of many countries, own land and property outside their home country. And this is liable for their property taxes too. So this campaign was to remind Danes that if you have a nice villa on the Costa del Sol, you're going to have to pay tax. So I got in touch with the Danish tax authority, where I can maybe help you identify all the Danish citizens who own land in the United Kingdom. They were a bit distrustful and the conversation ran dry. But what's interesting is that this chap on the top right, Mr. Anders Poulsen, who's a Danish billionaire, owns about 230,000 acres of land in Scotland. And I'm sure he's paying his grund tax in his home municipality of Esbjerg to build nice kindergartens like the one on the bottom right. The irony, of course, is he's paying no tax to local authorities in Scotland because all his estates are exempt from tax. So again, here's an example about how we frame tax policy, how we frame many policies, interact with how land is owned. And so just to conclude, I have a whole sort of talk about lessons from Europe, but I thought I'd just kind of draw one. I've kind of hinted at one already from Denmark. But this is to do with land ownership. I did a study 10 years ago on the ownership of private forests in Scotland. And what's really interesting is if you compare private forest ownership in Scotland with private forest ownership in 19 countries in Europe, you find that in Scotland, and this won't be much different across the UK, as you can see from the blue top graph, over 40% of the area of Scotland's private forests are owned in holdings of more than 100 hectares, so dominated by large holdings. By contrast, Europe is almost, literally the mirror opposite. 60% of Europe's private forests are owned in holdings of less than 1 hectare. Now, what explains this? Well, what explains this is two things. One, Scotland and the UK's very concentrated pattern of land ownership. And the second is the lack of land reform. So in continental Europe, following the French Revolution, a number of reforms rippled across European countries for the next 100, even 200 years. One of which was reforms to the law of inheritance, so that children had a legal right to varying degrees to inherit property. And what that meant is, over a century or more, these landed estates slowly got broken up. And tenants also got ownership of their property. So you ended up with a small-scale pattern of ownership in which included trees, and that's why the pattern in Europe is like it is. It's also because in Scotland, and I'm not sure the rest of the UK, tenant farmers have no rights to trees. Legally, they belong to the landlord, so they never planted trees. Until 2003, when the Scottish Parliament changed the law and allowed tenants to plant trees. But again, Europe's farmers were owners, so they owned the trees. Now, if you own a small number of trees, the other thing you do is you work out how to market them. Now, you can't market them on your own because you don't own very much. And that has led to the development of huge cooperatives in continental Europe in the forestry sector, like Södra in Sweden or Metsä Corporation in Finland. These are owned by tens, hundreds of thousands of small landowners, vertically integrated in the supply chain. So how land is owned has profound effects on the economy, on society, and on land use. And just to conclude, on land reform, what is land reform? Well, it's basically the process of reforming the relationship between land and society. That's a legal relationship in terms of tenure. It's a relationship that is fiscal in terms of taxation, and it's a political relationship. That's to do with administrative law around nature conservation, planning, environmental controls, all those kind of things. The kind of constraints that are placed upon owners of land in the public interest. And as an important review group in 2014, this is, if you want to understand Scotland's land issue and some of the challenges and issues, Google the Land Reform Review Group report of 2014. They defined land reform as measures that modify or change the arrangements governing the possession of use of land in Scotland in the public interest, which is quite a good definition. So I'll conclude there. Thanks very much indeed, and I look forward to discussion later.
Thanks very much indeed, Andy. That's lovely. So later in this programme, what we hope to do is look at the issue of land reform in greater detail, especially community land ownership. Let me introduce though now Laurie Macfarlane. Laurie's been working on land markets in Scotland, particularly in the area of biodiversity offsetting and carbon offsetting, but he's also the author of Rethinking Land, the Economics of Land and Housing, one of the kind of leading books to put land markets and land value at the heart of housing affordability. So Laurie, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to try and get my slides up. Can everyone see that okay?
Yep.
Excellent. Okay, well, thanks very much. It's wonderful to be here and be able to participate in this conference. And yeah, interesting to hear everything from Andy there. Hopefully what I'm going to be speaking about will very much speak to some of that, and I also look forward to, yeah, getting involved in the discussion and hearing what people have got to say. In the brief time I've got, I'm going to be focusing mainly on a report that I co-authored early in the year that was commissioned by Community Land Scotland, focusing on an issue that is in one sense, quite new and quite recent, focusing on issues around carbon offsetting and quote unquote natural capital and the impact that that's having on the land market in Scotland. Although it's worth saying that although in some senses this is kind of quite new and recent, in another sense it's very much speaking to issues that are very much long-standing and are sort of the most recent manifestation or symptom, if you like, of some of the issues that we face in relation to land governance and land ownership and some of the things that Andy was just talking about. And I should also say as well that in relation to the sort of housing side of things, I'm going to touch on that a little bit, but very much happy to get into that side of things much more as well in the discussion if we want to go there in terms of sort of land market, housing, etc. But I'm mainly going to be focused on the sort of climate carbon offsetting just in the presentation. So in terms of the genesis of this work, some of you might have been aware around the recent-ish, certainly in historic terms, discussion around the rise of green lairds, which is a term that has been sort of thrown about quite a bit in Scotland, and this relating to, you know, investors buying up land with some kind of nominal environmental goal, environmental and often financial goal related to it. And so what we wanted to do with this work and what Community Land Scotland were interested in is sort of unpicking that a little bit, recognising that this has been having quite a significant impact on land markets in Scotland, including on ownership and use. And so what we're trying to do was to sort of move beyond the broad term around green lairds and instead unpick that a little bit and look at, well, what's actually going on? Who are the players here, and crucially, what impact is this having, and what does that mean for questions of land reform going forward here in Scotland? And so just in terms of some of the broader context around this, as some of you will probably already know, really to start with around the sort of global embrace of net zero targets. Net zero targets, obviously, we've seen governments around the world embrace net zero targets. We've also seen corporations, private sector actors embrace net zero targets as well. Now, given the definition of net zero itself, what we've seen is businesses and governments as well, sort of recognizing that one way to achieve net zero goals, obviously you can reduce your emissions, but another way to do that is to offset them and by basically acquiring carbon credits. Now, on the screen, you can see some headlines from the financial press from this year, and we've seen a really sort of soaring interest in carbon markets and loads of investor interest basically in acquiring carbon credits which can be used to offset emissions to help reach net zero goals and help sort of increase sort of green credentials, etc. Now,
Laurie, can I intervene there, because I can't see your slides and a couple of other people can't.
Can anyone else see my slides?
I can see the slides, but they didn't move on to the second slide, the press cuttings one.
Okay, let me just.
You can navigate backwards and forwards if you go down to the bottom of the screen.
Yeah,
and it's,
I'm on slide 2 here.
Navigate yourself along.
Yeah, so I'm on slide 2 here on my shared screen. You can't see that.
No, but we can actually move it. I can actually move it on.
That's really bizarre. Yeah, I'm sharing my screen and I'm moving along. Can you see my desktop screen just now?
No, just your first slide. Would you like us to navigate onto the next slide for you?
Yeah, I mean, I could stop and start again if that might work, but it says I'm definitely sharing my screen and I'm definitely moving along the slides, so I'm not sure what's happening. Let me just try one more time. Might make it a little bit easier.
Okay.
Can you see?
Yes.
Yeah. You can see that okay?
I can see slide 2 now.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that. I'm not sure what was going on there. Yeah, are. Okay, well, let's just stick with that. And if you can move along and you can't see, then just please do move along when I say that. Probably the easiest thing. So anyway, if you can see on the screen, this is just press clippings. It's nothing too important anyway, but basically just highlighting the fact that there's been a surge of interest, investor interest in carbon offsetting and acquiring carbon credits. Now, the key point being that the generation of carbon credits for offsetting purposes crucially involves land, access to land, and lots of it. Things like tree planting and peatland restoration are the kinds of things that can be used to generate carbon credits, and therefore either sold on and acquired by investors to offset their emissions, or indeed, if you are the landowner, you can keep so-called insetting, keep the carbon credits to offset your own emissions yourself. So I'm just moving on to the next slide now, if anyone wants to follow. So this is a global issue. This is something that's happening around the world just now. It's by no means unique to the UK or by Scotland. But in Scotland, we do have a number of sort of specific features, if you like, of our land governance, which makes it particularly attractive for those seeking to acquire land for carbon offsetting purposes. So some of the things that Andy was just talking about, we have a large rural land area, we have a highly concentrated pattern of ownership, we have a largely or lightly regulated land market, meaning that anyone can really buy land with relatively little scrutiny, which is quite unusual. And we also have a relatively favourable tax and subsidy regime, which is something that we'll come back to. Now, so what that means is that it's very easy for, you know, if you're a global investor, you're a company, and you're looking to get into the carbon offsetting game, Scotland is very much a place where you might go. One of the things we do in the report as well is just look at, well, what impact is this actually having on Scotland's rural land market? And we look at the most recent data over the past year. The Scottish Land Commission's also done some work on this more recently, which is consistent with what we find. And so we find across all types of rural land, we see prices rising quite rapidly, and particular rise in off-market sales. So just here we see some data for estates and forestry and agriculture, record levels of investment, significant price increases, and as I said, increasing numbers of sales happening off-market. Now, it's important to say that there's quite a lot of different things happening here, a slight caveat. Part of this is around things like a very buoyant timber prices, partly about subdued levels of supply, but all the evidence from the Scottish Land Commission and indeed from estate agents, etc., is pointing to the fact that the emerging value of carbon offsetting and other forms of natural capital, which I'll come on to talk about, is becoming an increasingly important driver of demand in the land market in Scotland. And what we're seeing is, to some extent, sort of expectations about future revenue generation from this type of activity being capitalized into land values today, particularly for types of land that are well suited for types of carbon reduction and carbon sequestration. Now, in order to see what's going to happen here, obviously helps to follow the money. And in many ways, the whole system of carbon offsetting is being designed to encourage private investment into the types of activities that we're talking about. And obviously, private investment will only happen if they're able to generate a return. And so we have various different schemes in place at the moment operating in Scotland and across the UK, which enable that to happen. And so we have two carbon credit schemes operating, the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Code. And we also have a number of grants available to landowners to support things like woodland creation, peatland restoration, and various types of other nature restoration as well. Now, one thing that's important to say is that while we only currently have two carbon credit schemes in operation, at the moment, it's possible that in future we'll have more broader natural capital markets come online. And we already see in England the principle of biodiversity net gain is already being incorporated into the planning system, for example, which will create a new market for biodiversity credits, which is another type of natural capital market. And we're seeing experiments for other similar schemes, which sometimes are also called payments for ecosystem services, start to pop up across the UK. And this might apply to other areas like farm soil, hedgerows, water quality, but the basic principle being opportunities for landowners to generate revenue for managing land a certain way. And indeed, if we do see other mechanisms come online, opportunities for revenue generation, that will likely have a feedback effect on land values as well. But for the time being, it's carbon credits that are the main game in town. And so one thing that we wanted to explore is what's happening in the market for carbon credits, how's that affecting the land market, and how might this affect things in the future. Now, in the paper, we looked at the sort of forecast such as they exist for carbon offset prices. So this is the price that investors pay for a ton of carbon to offset their emissions. Now, there's a huge amount of uncertainty around this, and it's really important to stress that. And there's many factors at play. Crucially, obviously, this is partly a political decision around whether or not governments actually are successful at reducing emissions, the extent to which governments permit carbon offsetting to take place, the extent to which the rules that apply to carbon offsetting are changed, the extent to which new regulations are brought in. But certainly, both at a global and a national level, there has been a very big push to encourage carbon offsetting. And this chart just shows the range of sort of forecast prices for carbon offsetting from a range of different sources, all stressing huge amount of uncertainty. We're not making a prediction here. We're not saying this is good or desirable. We're just saying this is a range of forecasts produced by a range of credible academic and other sources, all sort of forecasting that actually the price of carbon offsets is set to increase going forward. Now, obviously, these are forecasts. They might be wrong. We might hope that they might be wrong, and indeed, governments might take steps to stop this. But the reason that this is important, which I'll explain a little bit later, is that various market actors are taking these types of forecasts seriously, and they're changing their behaviour today. And I'll show a case study of this in a little bit, and showing how this is then in turn affecting land markets in places like Scotland. And crucially, obviously, if this is in turn, as we've seen, the sort of race to buy land for carbon offsetting purposes is pushing up land values, investors expecting that they'll be able to generate carbon credits and either keep them to offset their emissions or sell them on. A key question, of course, is, well, who are these actors? You know, how is this impacting patterns of land ownership in places like Scotland? Who is it that's going to be sort of reaping the financial rewards associated with this activity? And what are some of the potential side effects of that, the potential sort of undesirable side effects that might be associated with that? So we develop a bit of a typology to kind of unpick this a little bit in the paper and say, well, actually, who are the types of different owners in Scotland or actors who are buying land for some of these reasons? And among these are corporate landowners. So you might have seen in the news some corporations buying land as part of their in order to do things like woodland restoration, in order to enhance their green credentials or contribute to their net zero goals. We see companies like Brewdog have done this and various others. We're also seeing asset managers, so financial institutions doing this, buying land with the explicit aim of generating and selling carbon credits to their clients. We also have, again, which is not new, various charity and NGO landowners. We see individual estate owners and, of course, community ownership as well. So this isn't a kind of, we're not trying to make a sort of subjective assessment here of what's good or bad here. This is just an assessment of these are some of the different models that are at play here. But I just want to draw attention a little bit to the corporate and asset manager side of things, because this is quite new. We have some new actors coming into the land market. And what are they doing? Well, there's a whole range of different things that some of these actors are doing or purporting to be doing in buying land. So sometimes it can be about rewilding. Often it's about carbon offsetting, which I just talked about. Sometimes about carbon insetting, which is buying land so they can offset their own emissions rather than sell on carbon credits. Some parts of forestry, renewable energy, predicting that there will be some of these other natural capital markets come online in future, which will enable further revenue generation, all different kinds of things. And of course, things like tax benefits, land value appreciation, etc., things that we're quite familiar with for some time. And so in the paper, we do a bit of mapping around looking at different case studies of different types of actors, corporate actors, asset managers, various different types, and say, well, what are they actually saying that they're going to be doing? what are the benefits that will derive from that? So I just want to draw one example, because we don't have time to go into all of them obviously here, but one interesting example here that kind of illustrates some of the dynamics at play is around Standard Life Property Income Trust. So Standard Life Property Income Trust acquired nearly 1,500 hectares of land in the Clare National Park for nearly £8 million. Now, the company said that it plans to sequester approximately nearly 200,000 tonnes of carbon through tree planting and peatland restoration, and it thinks that the cost of that will be met through grants, so purely through grant funding. And that price equates to around £2,000 an acre, although that's quite high on a per acre basis compared to, you know, other recent market activity. The company's sort of looking at this through the lens of, well, per tonne of carbon, they think they've got quite a good deal, because by purchasing land that has the potential to offset roughly 200,000 tonnes of carbon for £7.5 million, the company's basically locked in a price for offsetting its emissions for the next 50 years of 38 pounds per tonne of CO2. Now, this is higher than current prices in the carbon credit market, but if, as this diagram shows, prices increase going forward, the company's locked in that price by actually buying the land, then it thinks it's got a pretty good deal. And so in this sense, we see Standard Life and many others sort of speculating basically on the future price of carbon, wagering that it will save costs over the long term by moving now to lock in a fixed price for offsetting by actually acquiring land, rather than acquiring carbon credits in future on the open market. And so it's this kind of a new, relatively new kind of speculation here that's then feeding back into the land market. Now, important to say as well, Standard Life is not selling carbon credits on the market, but it's using these to inset its own emissions. So this is just one example, but I think just to sort of highlight some of the implications around this, the emerging value, quote unquote, associated with this activity of carbon offsetting and natural capital more broadly, it is having a significant impact on land markets, and it's having a significant impact on land value. It's also having an impact on patterns of ownership with new actors coming into play, and also use. And we see potentially as well, if the financial rewards from this type of activity continue to increase, there'll be pressures to switch use of land from certain activities into this type of stuff if it will be lucrative enough. And we're of course seeing the emergence of new types of institutional corporate landowners. Now, we can get into this more detail in the discussion, but this has a number of implications and in many ways sort of exacerbates long-standing issues in Scotland's land market, some of the things that Andy was talking about. So entrenching concentrated ownership, exacerbating potentially things like rural housing crisis, undermining biodiversity goals by seeing very homogeneous tree planting and things like that, and potentially facilitating greenwashing as well, if what we're seeing is for example, fossil fuel companies and other large polluters investing heavily in carbon credits, which enable them to offset their emissions while basically continuing to pollute as normal. Now, in terms of the Scottish Government's policy goals, we sort of assess these developments against things like just transition, land reform goals, community wealth building, etc., and find that there's basically quite a significant growing disconnect between what's actually happening in the land market and these stated policy goals. And we can talk about some of these things in a bit more detail. But really getting to grips with some of this stuff requires fundamental reforms to governance and ownership of land in Scotland, and indeed the functioning of carbon markets as well. But it's worth just stressing as well that this is one sort of issue among many, but underlying all of this are very, very long-standing issues. And this is just the latest, this is just one latest sort of manifestation of these. And so it speaks very much to the need for wider land reform. And just briefly, because I know I'm running out of time, but in terms of some of the things that we talk about in the paper, in terms of the sort of wider policy agenda, one thing I think is very important is around regulation of carbon markets. Now, there's obviously a question around carbon offsetting generally. Should it be permitted at all? Is it a distraction from reducing emissions? But at the moment, it's a bit of a wild west. It's a voluntary regulated market. There's very, very, very light regulation, and crucially, anyone can be acquiring carbon credits to offset their emissions, even if they are big polluters, for example. And so if carbon offsetting is to be permitted at all, we suggest that it should only be able to be used to avoid emissions to offset emissions that are genuinely unavoidable, rather than just offsetting any emissions when the real focus should be actually on reducing emissions. It also feeds into wider issues around governance, and in Scotland there's been a lot of discussion around public interest tests. So this issue of is it right that anyone can come in and acquire large swathes of land with very few questions asked? And there's a discussion just now in Scotland about public interest tests and what they could look like and what the criteria should be. But again, I think this is very relevant in this case, but also more broadly. Public land acquisitions, we've already seen the Scottish Government does intend to scale up public land acquisitions. Public land acquisitions either could be used to be held in perpetuity in public ownership, or broken up and sold off, transferred to community ownership, etc. As Andy mentioned, long-standing debates around taxation, but also around grants, making sure that use of public money is only being used to serve public policy goals, and looking, are we creating some perverse incentives here, encouraging activities that might not be desirable or might be actually exacerbating some issues. Also scaling up community ownership and other ownership models, which we come on to talk about. A lot of evidence that community ownership delivers far better outcomes, not just on environment, but also socially and economically as well. And what can be done there, and obviously some of what's been happening here is in many ways undermining the ability to scale up community ownership, given that we're seeing significant increases in land values. These acquisitions need to be funded, and so issues around access to finance as well. And so I'm not going to be able to go into all of these because there's a lot to discuss, but hopefully that's given a bit of a sense of some of the work that we did in this paper. I look forward to hearing people's thoughts. But I think the key thing to emphasize here is that this is one quite specific angle here, but it very, very much speaks to some of the long-standing underlying issues around land ownership, land governance. And so I think that it's something that, something that we look forward to hearing your thoughts on. So I will stop sharing my screen if indeed you can even see it, but thanks very much for listening.
Thanks very much indeed, Laurie. Yeah, I think we could follow along on the slides. That's brilliant, and raised lots of questions in the chat. I'm glad to see. And if you've got any questions, please remember, just put them down in the chat and we'll be getting to you very soon. So we've looked at issues of land ownership and what's happening in the land market at the moment, but what about the public? What about the community? So let's turn to Kate Ashbrook from the Open Spaces Society. So over to you, Kate. Your microphone, Kate. You're on mute.
Thank you. Okay, hello everybody. Okay, my talk's a bit different really, I think. First of all, we only cover England and Wales, I'm sorry to say. So I'm going to be talking about England and Wales and not Scotland. I'm talking really about the history of the Open Spaces Society, but so much of our history is relevant to what is happening today. So I wanted just to go back to the time of our formation, which was 157 years ago, when 1865, and we were formed at the time that the end of the enclosure movement and the start of the time when people were beginning to understand about the importance of recreation and getting out, beginning to get railways and transport, but also there was development of open spaces happening at the same time. Originally, we were formed to protect common land, which is a particular type of land. I now can't move my slides on. There we go. And just to give you a few examples of common land, the point about common land is that it is land that has an owner, but other people have rights on it, and that might be to gather wood or bracken or to graze animals or dig peat, and those rights are in connection with their personal economy. So that is in order to survive, and that's how so many people survived in the past, was living off the land and exercising these rights. And commons still survive today, but there are far fewer and far less in area, but they are very special and they cover a wide range of landscapes. So here we are at Pumlummon in central Wales, a very broad open common, and then we get the very kind of cosy, intimate commons in the lowlands, where they're close to people's homes. There are many different sorts of commons. This is an example of common rights being exercised in East Sussex, collecting the bracken, and they also have cultural history of beating the bounds. They're rich in archaeology, they're rich in wildlife, they're very beautiful, and we have public access there. So they are immensely important. And in the beginning, our legal advisors helped to save many of the London commons. So Hampstead Heath, Wimbledon Common, Epping Forest, all were rescued thanks to our early activists. The commoners' rights in those cases were being challenged, and we helped to defend the commoners in protecting their rights. Very early on in our existence, we helped to secure the Metropolitan Commons Act 1866, which excluded enclosure of any common within the Metropolitan Police District, which is kind of 3 miles around central London, and therefore that was very significant. And we were founded at a meeting in Lord Eversley's chambers in the Inner Temple, and Lord Eversley, or George Shaw Lefebvre as he was known, was a Liberal MP for Reading, and he held many posts under the Gladstone government, and every time Gladstone came in and he had to hold, he was called to hold a post, he had to resign as chairman of our organisation. So he was in and out a lot, but he was always there for us. And others who were in at the beginning, John Stuart Mill, Charles Dilke, Octavia Hill, Robert Hunter, and some establishment figures like the Duke of Westminster, which always puzzles me, W.H. Smith, and William Morris as well. There's William Morris. I have to put him in because I just love that little drawing of him in Iceland. So this rather unlikely band of campaigners immediately set about collecting evidence of the continued existence of common rights, and they aroused local opposition, they formed local committees, they raised funds to fight lawsuits, and they raised money from some of their rich backers, and generally were pretty successful. There was one very colourful example at Berkhamsted Common 1866, where Lord Brownlow had erected iron railings, and our organisation had connection with someone with common rights, Augustus Smith, who was also Lord of the Scilly Isles and a Cornish MP, and he arranged for a trainload of navvies to go in the middle of the night to Berkhamsted Common, and they walked the 3 miles from Tring Station to the Common and felled the fencing, and it was never put back. So we have a good history of direct action, of which I'm very, very proud. Although that case did take a long time to resolve because Lord Brownlow did then start on legal action. I will just mention the National Trust because we wanted to be able to hold land, and for some reason we felt we couldn't be an organisation to hold land, but we also knew that that was the way to protect land. So our founder, Robert Hunter, then went on to found the National Trust, and we helped the trust to acquire properties. So we raised money, formed local committees, and then gave land to the trust. So Mare Cop, which is a wonderful viewpoint right in the middle of England, was saved by us, raising the money and giving it to the trust. A very important victory, but there were many, many of those. And then a bit later on, we took on public rights of way at the end of the 19th century. And Octavia Hill, who is the founder of the National Trust, actually led on our taking on public paths. She talked about the little winding quiet byways that were under threat. But anyway, back to commons. I just want to mention about access, because that's so important. We won a right to walk and ride on all so-called urban commons in 1925 under the Law of Property Act 1925, and that allowed landowners also to dedicate their land for public access. And Pumlaman, which I showed at the beginning, belongs to the Crown Estate, and for some extraordinary reason the Crown Estate Commissioners did actually dedicate all their land under the Law of Property Act. They did this in 1932, all their Welsh commons, so that was quite significant. But we didn't actually get a right to walk on all commons until 2000 and the Countryside and Rights of Way Act. But meanwhile, commons were not recorded, and in 1965 we won the Commons Registration Act, which allowed for the registration of commons, but only allowed 3 years to do that. And it was far too short, and many commons which ought to have been registered were not registered. So a lot of commons are not on the register, although we are now running a project to try and get some of them rescued and recorded. So commons remain very much under threat. There is no duty on anybody to take enforcement action if somebody erects something on a common. The law says that if you want to put something on a common, you have to get consent of the Secretary of State for Environment or the Welsh Minister. But if you go ahead and do it without that consent, a local authority or a member of the public can take you to court, but they don't. They very rarely do. And so that law is very, very weak. But we'll just mention village greens as well, because village greens go back a long way. But the law defined them in 1965 as, among other things, land on which local people have rights for lawful sports and pastimes. So that can be the traditional skipping around the maypole, or it can be gathering blackberries, bird watching, kicking a ball, something very, very informal. And again, village greens, like commons, all had to be registered in the 3 years following the Commons Registration Act. And many were not registered. But because the law said that the definition of a village green is 20 years use as of right for lawful sports and pastimes, 20 years after the closing date for registration, we were able to start registering them again. So on the 1st of August 1990, we got very active and pressed people, if they'd been using the land ever since, to put in to register a green. And there were numerous court cases. This was very controversial. Sunningwell Village Green was one of the early ones. But the point about a village green is that local people have legal rights for lawful sports and pastimes there. And obviously you can't define a local person from a non-local person. So really everyone's got a right there in practice. And it protects them from any sort of encroachment. So it is a really, really strong protection. And the Conservative government got wind of this sort of about 10 years ago, a bit more than 10 years ago, and realised that people were applying to register land as village greens when it was threatened with development. Because if you love a space and it's threatened, obviously you want to do everything you can to protect it, and you suddenly realise you've been using it and enjoying it and it's threatened. So naturally you'd want to register it as a green. It's just a normal thing to do. But the government wanted to put a stop to that, and in the Growth and Infrastructure Act it did put a stop to it. And so now if land is in any way threatened with development, it's too late to apply to register it as a village green, which is really, really bad news. But one thing that can be done is that land can be voluntarily registered. And here's Scorton Village Green, where the parish council voluntarily registered a piece of land that they owned as a green. And we're saying to local authorities, if you own land, why not register it as a green? Because then it will protect it and give local people those rights there. So we see this as a really important tool. And we also think that developers should be forced, when they say in a development, oh, we're offering green space, you know, we're offering a village green. Well, they're not really. They're just offering something that might be for the residents of the area for a time, and then they'll probably build on it. So if they were required to register it as a green, then everyone would have the right there and it would be protected. So we see this as a really, really important tool against development. So if I just move on to today, the kind of things that are in our heads that we're working on. I mean, first of all, I mentioned registering lost commons, and I mentioned how the Commons Registration Act only allowed 3 years, and then the shutters came down. That was it. Anything not registered ceased to be a common. But the registers were partially reopened in Wales and in parts of England, so that we can, by doing research and finding certain bits of land that failed the first time, or were not eligible the first time because of certain law cases going through at the time, and we're trying to get them registered. So this is just a tiny piece that we've managed to register, and we're running a project to do that. And we're hoping to get the government to extend the opportunities so that the Act will apply over the whole of England. It only at the moment applies in Cumbria and North Yorkshire, so it's very limited. We're also trying to use the local green space, which is part of the planning in England, which offers some protection. This was a kind of mitigation that the government offered when they took away the right to register greens on land threatened with development. They offered local green space. It does give some development, and some people have managed to do this. You have to get your planning authority to identify it during the neighbourhood and local plan process. But it doesn't offer absolute protection, and anyway, I suspect that the Levelling Up Bill is going to overtake that. There is the question of the Levelling Up Bill and what this will do and not do, and we are very concerned, along with other members of the Planning Coalition, of which we're a member, the fact that this is going to take the democracy out of planning and give far too many too much weight to the Secretary of State. And I know we've got CPRE members on this call who will actually know a lot more about this than I do, but it's an opportunity, but it's also very much a threat. And looking at access, we want to see access included in the environmental land management schemes in both England and Wales. Government promised, as the Agriculture Bill went through Parliament, that public access was a public good for which public money should pay for public goods, but we have yet to see it included in any of the BLM schemes that are being developed, which is a worry because government did promise it, and there's a lot of money going into the ELMs, and of course it should be paying for public access where people want it. So we're feeling pretty let down about that, and we're pressing hard on that. And also, I know someone put something in the chat about inheritance tax exemption, which I think we don't do anything like enough on, and I think we should develop campaigns on this. There are a huge number of landowners who are supposed to be providing new access in exchange for inheritance tax exemption, and they're not doing so. And I don't think we're checking up on that anything like enough. I mean, it was interesting the other day when people had a trespass on Richard Benyon's land at Englefield, and somebody said, oh, you know, look at his website, look at all the access he's offering, permissive access that he's offering without, you know, just offering it. But then you look on the inheritance tax exemption website, and you see that actually he's being paid a lot of money to offer access. So this is going on everywhere, and I think we need to expose this as a really interesting and important campaign. So I shall end there. I hope I've given us sort of a few ideas, a few thoughts, but we go back such a long way. We are the first national conservation body, certainly covering England and Wales, and so we have a long history, but I hope we have a long future as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Kate. That's great. And wonderful to see those issues raised. So we're going to move now to questions, and can I introduce my colleague Donna Lee at this point? Donna's going to do the difficult task of selecting questions and pass them on to the speakers. Donna, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here, Quintin. Yeah, so I'm gonna go back to the beginning of the chat because there's been quite a lot of questions. Apologies if we don't get a chance to read all of them, but we'll try and get through as many as we can. So I'm going to start with, I guess we'd open this up to everybody. Should the new monarch pay capital gains tax on his inheritance?
I saw that one. I thought that was, we'll start Andy off on that one because I think that might be a topic that he would like to talk about. Andy.
Well, in principle, yes. I mean, I think everyone should be equal before the law. The capital gains tax is not something that when you inherit, might be talking about inheritance tax. Capital gains tax is paid when you sell something and it is worth significantly more than it was when you bought it, and you pay tax on the gains, for example, shares in companies or land. So inheritance tax, it's interesting because, of course, I don't know about the private estates in England, but Balmoral is not owned by the Queen. It's owned by a company called Quintin Limited, I think. And it's owned by trustees. By law, it has to be owned by trustees. So it hasn't changed ownership. And I think probably be the same for Sandringham and etc. Probably, I don't know, I haven't looked to them. But then there's the inheritance, and of course, the new monarch won't inherit Buckingham Palace, owned by the Crown, but he will inherit something like £500 million. I've read, but the royal wills are not published as other people's wills are published. The Guardians did a long campaign under FOI to try and get them published. But yes, in principle, of course, the monarch, like anybody else, should pay inheritance tax. I think that's perfectly reasonable.
Exactly. So, Kate, you raised inheritance tax as a big issue. So, one for you here, I think.
Well, I mean, just yes, you know, most certainly, and I'm quite sure there's scope for much more access on the Crown land as well. I believe that, and Andy can correct me on that, or others. I know Ramblers are on this call. That in fact the access to Balmoral under land reform was okay. There wasn't really any argument about that. But I mean, I do think that, yeah, Sandringham and the other estates, you know, there could probably be a lot more access. But anyway, the answer is yes.
Thanks, Kate. Capital gains tax was, I think, the questions. Laurie, we don't talk about capital gains really in terms of land, do we? We usually think about that in terms of home ownership. To what extent does it play a major role in terms of land market activity? Microphone.
Yeah. So just on that, just picking up on the question of the King, just briefly, there was an analysis by Tax Justice UK recently which estimated that it would be, I think, £148 million of inheritance tax that that would be paid but isn't being paid. So that's obviously quite a significant chunk on the private estate that he's inheriting. And I mean capital gains tax, it's an issue which you know, that is politically challenging, and it's one of on the housing side, one of the biggest tax exemptions that we have. It's worth tens of billions every year, is the exemption on primary residences of primary residences on capital gains tax, and you know, that's an enormous sum of money, and of course the amount of capital gains that have been realised on primary residences over the course of recent decades has been astronomical and has been largely untaxed, and so has contributed significantly to you know, that huge amount of wealth that is being held in primary residences. And so I think that is an issue which I think ought to be raised and should be, but it's something that politicians often you know, often shy away from, which I think is you know, is not great. And yeah, I mean, on capital gains on land more generally, I mean, I think that you know, this links to one of the questions as well that I think was in the comments about what's happening currently in terms of land reform. I think that the question of tax generally, unfortunately, although there's, you know, it looks like there's some progress going to be made, certainly in Scotland in this current land reform phase. The question of taxing land is something that unfortunately isn't really being raised, or raised the extent to which it should be, or it isn't being discussed by the government at the moment. And so I think that collectively raising the issue of tax is something which we should be doing, and doing more forthrightly. Capital gains tax is one of the reserve taxes, so it's not something which devolved government can do anything on. But there are, of course, a range of other taxes which are devolved, which could be used to tax land. And you know, we can talk about the issue around non-domestic rates and exemptions around that, or indeed other alternatives to that, land value tax, etc. But I think the question of land is something, the question of tax, I think, is something which the Scottish Government at the moment is sort of shying away from. And indeed, we're not seeing any signs from the UK Government that we're going to see any major changes on capital gains or inheritance, which could really help this. So I think tax is so important. It's something which is something which unfortunately isn't something that I think we're going to see much progress on.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Laurie. Yeah, good question there as well. Back to you, Donna.
Okay, so the next one's more a comment than a question, but I'm sure it'll get some kind of debate going. So Russia wouldn't need to invade. They could just buy the land out from underneath us without anyone realising. 247 million is peanuts compared to the price of gas and oil. There must be some protections to prevent hostile purchases.
Okay, so this is foreign ownership of land and the ease of land purchasing. And Laurie, I think you raised this point to start with.
Yeah, I mean, the UK is quite unusual in the extent to which there are very few rules around, you know, who can come and buy land, and the sort of scrutiny around that and the rules around that. And so yeah, you know, we have had, as Andy has pointed out, we do have significant amounts of land that have been bought up by foreign residents, you know, both in terms of rural land, huge parts of the country, but also, of course, in terms of housing, real estate as well. You know, huge amounts of wealth, including Russian wealth. London's property market, for example, is huge amounts of money being poured in there, and lots of the wealth, often nefarious wealth, that's been accumulated not just in Russia but elsewhere. London's property market is often acted as basically a sort of global laundromat for that money, And so I think this is an issue which, you know, is right to raise. I do think, though, as well, that part of the issue here is around the fact that we've created an environment where it is so attractive for, you know, whether it's ill-gotten wealth or not ill-gotten wealth or whatever, for, you know, land and property in this country is such an attractive vehicle to sort of plough wealth into. And I think if we address some of the underlying issues here, then that would address that without necessarily targeting foreign people as such. You know, addressing some of the issues fundamentally would mean that regardless of whether it's somebody foreign or somebody domestic, having a situation where acquiring large amounts of land relatively easily, or acquiring property with the aim of having a sort of tax efficient or a way to launder your money, or indeed to realize capital gains, addressing some of those issues fundamentally, I think, is probably the priority. And in doing so, yes, that would stop some of these issues around foreign money coming in. But I think that's the way to go about it, rather than sort of targeting specifically foreigners coming in and buying stuff. It's about sort of changing the fundamentals in the first place, and that would, one of the byproducts of that would go a long way to stopping that, I think.
Thanks, Laurie. Andy, I suppose absentee landlordism has been traditionally one of the biggest issues in terms of rural land in Scotland. To what extent is that still on the agenda as a key problem?
Well, it's on the agenda as a key problem. It's not on the agenda as anything to be done about, anything that should be done about it. I mean, Laurie's right about tackling underlying, and this is actually one of the features of land debates, is that this is kind of difficult stuff. It's what I call the archaeology of power. You've got to kind of dig quite deep to understand this, and it's not just deeply rooted in our kind of legal and political fabric, but it's deeply rooted as well in history. So it's hard work. So it's easier to try and kind of identify symptoms and then tackle symptoms, and that's often not terribly helpful. I mean, there's two things I would say. I mean, one is that Laurie's right about the very open property market in the UK. It has very, very few restrictions or constraints or whatever. And one of the consequences of having a very open land market is that literally anyone from anywhere in the world can come and buy land in the UK. And one thing that does is it pushes up prices. So if you take a small island off the west coast of Mull, which in itself is an island off the west coast of Scotland, there was a push to bring that into community ownership a few years ago when it was on the market, and it was successful. But they had to pay, I don't remember what the sum was, but it was £2 or £3 million they had to pay. Now, that is the market value of Ulva. The economic value of Ulva, I mean, if you were to go out and buy a business that included goodwill, trading, stock, factory, whatever, you would look at the books and you'd work out how profitable this industry is, you'd look at various other things, and you'd pay a capital sum that reflected its economic value to you. You may not want to make a return for 10 years, you may invest a lot in it, whatever, but you're seeking to make a return. That's in contrast to places like Ulva, which are used speculatively. So the economic value of a small island like Ulva is probably about £200,000 or £300,000. There's some returns from some holiday lets, there's a farming tenancy, I think there is some fishing, that's it, right? That is not £2 and £3 million economically. But if someone from Dubai or someone from Argentina with vast sums of money who wants a safe haven for that money, quite likes it because of its the social status associated with it, then so that's one of the consequences of having it over open land, is hugely inflated land values. And the other thing we can do to sort of tackle this as well is to insist more on residency. You know, if you want to buy land, you should live there. I mean, I don't mind Danes and Swedes and Norwegians and people buying land in Scotland if they come and live here, because they're entitled to live here, they will invest here and all the rest of it. And that would get rid of this sort of absenteeism, which is not very healthy. And it's worth noting, of course, that if you're a tenant, typically a housing tenant, if you're an agricultural tenant, if you're a crofting tenant, the law, the land tenure framework that governs your occupation of property will insist, and does insist to a degree, to varying degrees, that you actually are resident. And if you're not resident, you don't have the tenancy rights. And so that's a principle that's long been recognised, and I think it should be recognised in land ownership as well.
Thanks, Andy. So, Kate, one of the issues here is the distinction between the exchange value of land, the land market, and actually the use of land, isn't it? And the use that land has to local residents. Do you want to speak on that?
Yeah, well, I can't really comment on the actual question, but I do think that there's never a recognition by governments, by those in power, of how local people value land, you know, just for informal recreation for their health and well-being, and none of the economics take account actually of that, and particularly of the health value, the fact that people able to get out into local open spaces and get exercise are perhaps, you know, as a result staying out of hospital, and that's a huge saving on the NHS. So those kind of sums are never done.
Absolutely right. Donna, back to you. Another question, please.
Yeah, we've got a question here for Laurie. Is the corporate ownership model happening in England as well?
Laurie.
Yeah, so in relation to the carbon offsetting stuff, I assume. Yeah, I mean, this isn't, just to be clear, this isn't an issue that's unique to Scotland. It's also happening elsewhere in the UK and England and Wales as well. And there's, you know, growing concern, and the issue that we're talking about land being acquired easily, you know, that applies across the UK. It's not just in Scotland, and so it is very much an issue. Obviously, in Scotland, you do have the issue where land is particularly more concentrated in terms of ownership, and so it's easier to acquire large amounts of it. But it is also an issue elsewhere as well. And as I said before, in England, in terms of the sort of development of other natural capital markets, England is sort of further down that route than Scotland is at the moment. It's not just carbon credits. There's biodiversity net gain, which will be sort of tradable again, so introducing another sort of revenue stream for landowners, and then there's other sort of experiments happening as well. And so this is an issue that's relevant across the UK and indeed globally as well. It's not unique to Scotland. It's just that because of the sort of underlying circumstances and features of Scotland's land ownership and governance, it's particularly acute here. But certainly, yeah, there is growing concern across the UK, and I saw particularly in England, but also in Wales, there's been a bit of work being done there at the moment in terms of how this is affecting Wales as well. And so the other thing just to mention as well that's relevant here is that I mentioned that the carbon offsetting market, it's a voluntary regulated market just now, and the systems that are in place just now are UK wide. And so I do think that this is something where I think we need to move away from the sort of voluntary approach towards a much more formal government regulated approach in order to have some real regulation around this, and sort of clamp down and make sure that we're not having a sort of Wild West in this, and making sure that, as I say, if carbon offsetting is to be permitted at all, then it should be strict rules around ensuring that the activities that are happening are genuinely additional, and we're not just generating carbon credits for stuff that would have happened anyway, which is often happening. And then on the other side, in terms of the buyers, that we can't have you know, fossil fuel companies and others buying carbon credits generated here to offset their emissions while continuing to pollute as normal, but instead can only be bought by those who genuinely for emissions that genuinely can be demonstrated that can't be offset. And I think we probably do need to see action at a UK level to develop that regulatory model at the moment, and that's something that we're not seeing.
Thanks, Laurie. Notice, Donna, in the chat, there's points about nitrate mitigation and land purchases for that, which is speaking to Laurie's comments on the market there. Another question, if you can, please, Laurie. Donna.
Yeah, this one's more a comment than a question, but it sounds quite interesting. So somebody said, note that the SNIB are actually funding an investment firm to buy Scottish land for forestry. Our own money is being used to push up land prices and evict tenant farmers.
So, Laurie, you mentioned the sort of pension funds, insurance companies buying land. Do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, just briefly. So this is actually a case study that we talk about in the paper. So it's Gresham House, which is a big asset manager, and Scottish National Investment Bank, which is a publicly owned public investment bank set up with a mission on net zero. Its largest investment to date, which I think is very problematic, has been to hand £50 million over to Gresham House. And what Gresham House plan to do is to buy land, and they're primarily a forestry asset manager, but what they're trying to do is to do forestry, but also generate carbon credits from that as well. And so this £50 million, you know, is being used for that. And obviously we know, mentioned in relation to earlier about capital gains tax, but Gresham House explicitly marketing itself as you know, a very tax efficient investment, because not only are you going to be able to invest in Gresham Fund, generate carbon credits, offset your emissions, it's obviously forestry is a very tax efficient investment still today, exempt from capital gains tax, etc. And so it's a really bizarre use of money from the Scottish National Investment Bank to hand £50 million to a London-based asset manager to buy up land in Scotland to contribute to this problem. With very little benefit, and encourage this sort of tax efficient investment for things that are going to deliver very little tangible benefit, and of course in doing so exacerbate all the issues that we're talking about, and exacerbate issues and deliver very little benefit to local communities. So yeah, I think it was a really bizarre choice of investment, and if you're interested, that is a case study in the paper that we wrote, so there's more information there.
Thanks, Laurie. Kate, could I ask you to address this rather quaint idea that doing good in one place, in one bit of land, somehow you know, resolves any problems any pollution you might create in another site in a completely different location. This idea that land is interchangeable and you can mitigate and offset. Do you want to address that at all?
Yeah, well, I just think it's all very suspect, and particularly when you're talking about, you know, ancient woodlands and habitats that have been around for a long time. I just don't see that there's it's not an equal exchange. You know, things take a long time to develop. So I'm, you know, very skeptical about the biodiversity offsetting stuff, I must say.
Thanks, Kate. Donna, another question, please.
Yeah, this one's a question for Laurie and Andy. Are the land reforms in Scotland going far enough to tackle concentration of land ownership? What about other speculative landowners such as housing developers? Is there more that can be done through land reform to tackle their power?
Lovely. Okay, let's start with Andy for that one then, please.
Well, to deal with the second half of that first, housing developers, yes, there are. I mean, Laurie, Alistair Parvin's an architect in London. There's a whole range of kind of writers, designers, thinkers and economists who've said that there are different models of developing housing. And I hinted at the typical model in continental Europe. In fact, there was a Conservative MP recently raised an example of 6 women in Berlin, I think, it might have been Frankfurt. They were in their 50s, they gathered together and built a tenement block. But that is normal. That's really normal. Yes, there are ways, and the kind of ways that are being explored across the UK by kind of more progressive thinkers are things like public land assembly, so that public agencies acquire land, using, if necessary, compulsory purchase powers, and reintroducing laws we used to have around in the past, for example, around existing use value. So you buy it at its current use value. You buy it at £1,000 an acre agricultural land. You don't buy it at £1 million an acre with planning consent. You then master plan with people about the kind of housing design you'd like, etc. And then you sell plots. The public authority, the council, maybe a housing authority would sell plots. It would sell some of them to social housing providers, sell some of them to private individuals, maybe sell some to some modest volume builders perhaps. And they would build within a broad code. And this is what happens in Germany. You don't have this huge amount of detailed planning consent for each building. You have broad things like massing, spacing, aspect, height, colour, material, all that kind of stuff. And then you go and build. So there are models like that which are much more efficient in terms of the allocation of resources, so that you get more for your money. Because remember, even with speculative volume builders, the people who are paying for those houses at the end of the day are the people who buy the houses, right? Now, if they bought that house under a different model, they'd get a cheaper house and a better quality house, and a house that would more meet their needs, because they'd been in at the beginning, there's no land speculation, there's no shareholders, and more money would be spent on quality. So yes, there's a lot to be done in land reform and housing. It's a huge topic, but it's incredibly difficult to get any movement on, because governments across the UK, by and large, don't want to do anything that offends or puts off or loses the political support of homeowners, for whom rising land values, because that's what it is, houses do not rise in value. Houses depreciate. They are literally bricks and mortar. They are literally wearing away. It's land values that rise. So that's a massive problem. Many people in here will be better qualified to comment on me. In terms of the land reforms in Scotland going far enough, no, they don't. I mean, we've had a couple of land reform bills. They've done some useful things. There's a consultation at the moment by government on a new bill that they intend to introduce to Parliament at the end of next year, which purportedly is designed to tackle the scale and concentration of land ownership, but in fact only puts in a few measures that might intervene in certain circumstances in defined large land holdings. And if you look at land markets, actually the majority of land, I mean 40% of Scottish land hasn't traded in a century. So if you want to tackle the concentrated scale of land ownership, there's two proven means to do that. The first is succession law, inheritance law, and I indicated with the forest ownership. That takes a long time, but you know, the second best time to start doing that is now. The best time was 200 years ago. And the other one is proven, is tax. Absolutely proven. I mean, if you look at the pattern of land ownership across the United Kingdom, death duties, various inheritance taxes at various times have led to dramatic breakups of big estates and more plurality in land ownership. So tax is an incredibly easy and efficient way to tackle it, but government doesn't seem to be terribly keen to go there. So as long as we have these kind of market mechanisms that tend to be a bit bureaucratic and involve complex processes and only kick in on certain events which may never happen, it's not going to have much impact.
Thanks very much, Andy. That's brilliant. Absolutely. I'm so glad that you've said all that. And we've got a question further down in the chat. I think that Donna will see it, but it's on the where do we find the land for 300,000 houses? So, I mean, Laurie, so Andy here is saying public land assembly, buy it, purchase at existing use value, then a much more diverse model of house building. Would you go along with that?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, I think the current sort of speculative model of development is clearly a massive part of the issue here that contributes to lots of it. And I mean, interestingly, the UK government had the Wightman review a couple of years ago and sort of identified this problem of the market absorption rate. I mean, basically these builders, you know, they have an incentive to drip feed new homes onto the market precisely because they don't want to release too many homes in a way which will undermine their profits. And so, yeah, other ways, public-led approaches to land assembly, etc., can be much better, much more affordable, high-quality housing, as Andy said. Just on the point about, I mean, I would sort of question the premise of the solution being to build 300,000 homes a year. You know, I don't think the current affordability crisis or housing crisis generally, there are many different housing crises, but I don't think the idea that it's predominantly an issue of just supply, shortage of supply, I don't think is right. And when you look at the figures, not the kind of narrative that you hear, but in England, the amount of supply has outpaced household formation for quite some time. And I think the issue, although of course that doesn't mean we shouldn't be building more housing, we need to build new housing that's particularly affordable in the places that need it. But the wider issues are around, one, of the demand side, which is, in my view, the primary driver of the affordability issues, but secondly of distribution and the distribution of housing in this country. And I think looking at ways to shift that distribution in a way which is much more effective. I think it's much better. There was also just a paper on a side note recently which was looking at actually this question of, even if we were to meet the 300,000 homes a year target, that would blow the carbon budget way out the water anyway, and I can share that in the link if it's useful. So I don't think the 300,000 homes a year target is really the solution, and even if it were the solution, relying on the speculative model development to do that isn't going to work anyway. And so I think that yeah, we need to be looking at other things beyond, moving the argument away from the purely supply side view to some of these other issues around demand side and distribution, I think.
Thanks very much, Laurie. Donna, I think we've got some questions for Kate towards the end of the chat.
Yeah, we've got some stuff regarding village greens, so let's go for this one. So somebody said, aren't there examples of village green registrations used to block housing for local needs, with those greens never having served any community use? The chap asking the question has also said that he's thinking of incidental sites later used for site exceptions.
Okay, thanks very much. Kate, village greens and housing.
Yes, well, there may be. I don't know. I mean, everybody will have, you know, I expect the person who asked the question has an example, so I'm not going to say there is none. But I do think that what government never appreciated is that people just use, you know, these odd bits of land, and they're not the formal bit of land in the heart of the village. They are, you know, the bit of wasteland behind the housing estate or the railway, or, you know, that. But they actually go there and they use it, and they feel it's theirs, and they don't think about it. They just use it, and then when it's threatened, they suddenly realise that, you know, they and their kids have been using it, and so they want to protect it for that use. And in some cases, maybe it was a NIMBY thing, you know, just because they didn't want development there. But I genuinely think that I'm quite sure that people were genuine about this, and particularly in the lead up to the Growth and Infrastructure Act, we did actually sort of look at the government's analysis, and the government did not have the evidence to support what it was doing. It really didn't. It was very unclear. And I mean, if people don't have the evidence of use, then the application will be rejected. So you do have to prove. There are a lot of tests, and they've become harder as the Lords, the House of Lords and the Supreme Court and everybody got their hands on it. There are a lot of quite difficult tests to prove to win a village green. So as a generality, I would say no. You know, it has all been genuine.
Thanks, Kate. Donna, back to you.
Yeah, so we've got, this one's quite a lengthy one, but I'll go with this one. We have an affordability crisis which is about tenure and probably requires more social rent housing. Just building any number of expensive executive car dependent homes won't help anybody except those who profit from house building. Note that new dwellings percentage has increased more than population percentage has increased over the last few decades.
Yeah, so Laurie mentioned that in his last answer to question. Andy, let's go to you in terms of the situation in Scotland and house building. I mean, I'm always very guilty of not having a up-to-date knowledge of Scottish planning law. So what's the situation there in terms of housing targets and house building?
Well, the Scottish Parliament has ended right to buy. It did that a few years ago. That's a bit locking the store after the stable after the horse is bolted, but nevertheless. And there is quite a bit of investment going into social housing, both council housing and housing association housing. But it's nowhere near enough to meet the demand for affordable, genuinely affordable housing. I suppose that's the only really distinctive aspect of Scottish housing policy at the moment. Otherwise, the government has got targets in its national planning framework, and these targets are designed to be built by the usual suspects. There's no attempt to try and insist on a more democratic model of housing development, one that involves users, as I described earlier in response to a question. There's no effort to do any of that, which is rather unfortunate. And I think what's driving it is not so much housing policy, but economic policy, because Scottish Government, and same with UK Government, sees house building as a good way to generate economic growth and employment and all the rest of it, and takes the view, generally speaking, that the quickest, easiest way to do that is the model we've got at the moment, which is speculative volume builders. So I think it's a victim of a misguided economic policy that sees everything that's done in the economy as something that should be done quickly and cheaply to generate economic benefits. You see this in the forestry thing as well. I mean, we could insist that new forests, half of them are owned by communities, municipalities, social enterprises, local authorities, local residents, local businesses. We could insist on that if we wanted to, but we don't. The quickest and easiest way of getting trees in the ground is just getting those who've got lots and lots of money to do it. So I think that's the fundamental problem, frankly, rather than housing policy. Although housing policy is wrong, fundamentally it is wrong. And I suppose finally, this is a generic problem across the UK, is that government is very, very susceptible to powerful lobbyists. They're the people who are sitting in government advisory groups, and the interests of the trade body in Scotland is called Homes for Scotland. There'll be an equivalent trade body in England and Wales. The interests of those bodies are seen as synonymous with the interests of housing. And I've done FOIs that show that government thinks that the public interest in fisheries policy is synonymous with the interest of the Scottish Fishers Federation, that the public interest in housing is the same as the interest of Home for Scotland, that the public interest in agricultural policy is exactly the same as the interest of the National Farmers Union. All of course, this is nonsense, right? These are bodies which represent vested interests. They're entitled to exist. They're entitled to make their argument. They're entitled to argue for what they want, but they are not synonymous with a public interest. And so it's a betrayal of good policy making by government that's led us to this position, I think.
Thanks, Andy. Laurie, the question of land and the volume house builders, I suppose. Do we need to start reserving land just for social housing or for really affordable housing? I mean, is all the land going for market housing?
Yeah, I mean, I think social housing has got to be a key part of this. I mean, Scotland does have a slightly higher stock of social housing than England, and evidence that, I mean, Scotland's slightly lower poverty and child poverty rate is partly to do with that. It's partly to do with the fact that there's more social housing. And so, yes, I think that absolutely that's part of the issue. And the other thing just to mention as well is that in Scotland, there is not only on the social housing side, but also on the private rented side. So we had the rent freeze announced recently, and there is supposed to be at some point in this Parliament permanent rent controls coming in the private rented sector. And so we've yet to see what that looks like, but that's an interesting area of difference just now. But I think overall, part of the issue that we've had across the UK, you know, for decades and decades now in housing policy is this idea of the sort of pushing home ownership above all anything else, this idea of a sort of property owned democracy, which kind of, you know, for a period was successful in raising home ownership. Problem is that the kind of side effects of all of the things that we did to do that, sort of creating this huge bias towards home ownership across lots of areas of policy, was the fact that house prices began to become inextricably detached from incomes. And of course, the model kind of started to eat itself, because that then led to the home ownership declining since the early 2000s, and it's sort of started to tick up a little bit, but barely. And the government sort of UK government coming up with ever more innovative ways to try and kind of keep the show on the road, if you know what I mean, with various different things. Obviously, Help to Buy, we had the mortgage guarantee, you had Boris Johnson recently talking about intergenerational mortgages, passing on mortgages, so sort of coming up with ways to try and like just keep this, let's push home ownership at all costs, because obviously electorally that coalition is sort of underpinning that. And I think sort of moving away from that is key, not to say home ownership's bad, but looking at other tenures, social housing, a far more secure and affordable private rented sector. But as Andy said, the politics of this is just really, really, really tricky, because you have very, very powerful interests sort of benefiting from the status quo, including housing developers, but also including banks. Bearing in mind, most bank balance sheets are secured against residential land values just now. Mortgage lending is basically mostly what banks do now. They don't really lend to businesses in any great scale. But then most challengingly, of course, is the majority of households in the country who are owner occupiers, who also, you know, benefit from the system, which you know, of sort of ever rising house prices. And so the politics are very tricky. And I think there does need to be a sort of a new long-term approach of moving away from this idea that home ownership, pushing home ownership is somehow the answer, and scaling up other tenures. And part of that is about the development model underpinning that. And the speculative volume house builders aren't the answer. And so I think absolutely challenging that has got to be part of it. But it's tricky, and I think it's that the politics of it are more tricky than the actual sort of technical question of what to do about it. There are quite clear things I think that we know would be good to do and would improve things dramatically, but how to do that in a way, politically, in a way which also doesn't, you know, precipitate some kind of economic downturn, because housing plays such an important role in the UK economy, I think is the real challenge, and that requires long-term thinking and a sort of transition away from what we've been doing to something different. And unfortunately, long-term planning and thinking on this stuff isn't something that we do particularly well in this country.
Okay, thank you very much, Laurie. Donna, back to you, and let's see if we can get another question for Kate. If we can, I notice there's lots more questions.
Yes, let me see if I can find one for Kate. Hang on. Sorry, I'm just looking through. There's a lot of questions.
I know there's a lot has been added.
Yeah, there is. Oh, here we go. Right. So for Kate, on village green registration, the latest approach the OSS is advocating makes good sense. LAs can register open land they own as VG, and developers who include open space in their new developments can be, but currently are not required under a planning condition to register that land as VG. How can progress be made on both of these fronts?
Great, okay, that's lovely. I'll just package that with another question from Richard Hoggett, just further up the chat, which is on formally registered and designated commons. Is the right to use its resources restricted to local people, i.e. from the parish, or can anyone anywhere use them? So that's a question about common land use. So Kate, if you don't mind.
Okay, yeah, we'll go to Richard Hoggett, talking about commons, and they are different from greens. So commons, it's not a general right of local people to go and collect wood or dig peat or do any of those things, unless that's kind of explicitly said. What you have to do is look at the Commons Register and see which properties have the right to do those things. Of course, not many people do them now, and that's one of the whole problems of managing commons. Now they are getting very overgrown and scrubbed up, and so you have to have, you know, kind of people, volunteers going in and doing stuff, because people are not exercising their right, particularly the right of grazing, particularly in the lowlands where you've got busy roads and people don't graze animals anymore. They, you know, their property with the common rights might even be a second home. So the whole lifestyles have changed, which means that commons, it's not so easy to keep them in the way that we're accustomed. On the other hand, you might say, well, you know what, and there's the whole kind of issue about managing land. You know, what are we kind of aiming for with managing land? So, you know, where are we trying to be? So that sort of explains the commons issue. The village greens one, thank you for that question. Yes, absolutely. It's what we're proposing about voluntary registrations. And I mean, we're coming up against a bit of an issue, because I think local authorities are being advised not to register their land as village greens, because they're kind of giving away some of their ability, some of their flexibility, because they have to allow people to enjoy them for lawful sports and pastimes. I mean, I would say, you know, that's part of a local authority's role, is to, you know, provide public benefit. So I think we are going to get a bit of pushback, and we're going to have to work on that. But I'm thinking about whether to try and tackle just one or two big developers, really work with them to explain the benefits of doing the village green, registration as part of development, see if we can get them kind of, advocating some good practice. I'm not sure really what the approach is, but the question came from CPRE, which is great, because I know CPRE has been very interested in that, and we'd be very pleased, to work with you on that and to have your support. So thank you.
Put my microphone on. Thank you very much, Kate. Just a question for me, if I can use my powers on common land. Do you find that much of it is now managed by local authorities, and that the distinction between common and public land has been blurred?
Yeah, I think to some extent. I mean, it's owned by all sorts, actually, and the National Trust own a huge amount of common land, or local authorities can manage commons and open spaces under the Open Spaces Act. There are various bits of legislation. I think the general public doesn't know at all what a common is. They think it's commonly owned, and they don't understand, the historic interest. And so in the public eye, there probably is seen as common land. But I mean, we certainly want to preserve that kind of special nature of commons. We don't just want it to be lumped in with other public land, because they are so special in so many ways. And the percentage that are SSSIs, the percentage in protected landscapes, the percentage of ancient monuments on commons, it's all, very high figures and very impressive.
Thanks very much, Kate. Back to you, Donna. Another question from the
Kate, actually, if that's okay. So how optimistic are you that public access to land in England and Wales will broaden in the short to medium term?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that is an interesting question. Thank you, Danny, for that. And it's interesting because it comes from someone in Scotland, and I've been very I've been involved in sort of watching what's happened in Scotland, because I've been very involved in the Ramblers, and what interests me actually about Scotland is you've got the land reform, and it's absolutely brilliant, but you realise that people do also need paths, and now Ramblers are promoting this wonderful project, promoting mapping Scotland's paths, really terrific project, and so paths and access need to go together. And we in England and Wales, fortunate, we have the historic definitive maps of rights of way, and we now want greater access. The Countryside and Rights of Way Act was very limited in what it provided. It was all done kind of on mapping and vegetation and stuff. So we are thinking about what next, and we're thinking about access to woodlands, we're thinking about access to riversides, we're thinking about access close to people's homes, where they really will benefit from it. And how optimistic are we? Well, not immediately optimistic, really, because government, can't even manage to put the access into the environmental land management schemes, which is kind of a first port of call and really shouldn't be difficult, because there's public money available for that. So not terribly optimistic, probably a bit more optimistic in Wales, where the Welsh government asked Natural Resources Wales to come up with some proposals. It had a lot of discussions with which I was involved. It came up with a package of proposals which have been delivered to Welsh Government, and we're waiting for something to happen. So I think, but I also remember the campaign for the Countryside and Rights of Way Act. We started a good 10 years before we had a sympathetic government. So it's now is the time to be preparing, working out exactly what we're asking for, and to be ready for when we get some more sympathetic regime if this one cannot be persuaded.
Thanks, Kate. Andy, public access and community land ownership, are they in harmony in Scotland? Certainly you've got different public access laws than in England, and much better ones from my point of view. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, I mean, the legal framework in Scotland has been different from England and Wales for a long time, because I mean, it's complicated, and I'm really paraphrasing here, but essentially, and Kate will correct me if I'm wrong, essentially, if you walk on somebody's land in England and you're not on a right of way or whatever, you're committing a civil wrong merely by doing that. Kate's nodding, right? Good, I'm right. I think it's probably a little bit more complex, but that's fundamentally. In Scotland, you're not. I mean, in theory, and this I'm talking historically, in theory you are. Okay, in legal theory you are, but the remedies available by the landowner were to secure an interdict, or in England what would be called an injunction. So I wander across somebody's land, they don't like that. I'm off and away home before they've had any chance to go to court and secure an interdict. And if I'm not persistently doing it, they're not going to bother. So traditionally we have had what some people call the right to roam. It's not really a right to roam, but it's really a kind of a very permissive attitude that has been a degree of tolerance, been strained at times, but a degree of tolerance between those who seek to take peaceful enjoyment of the countryside and the people who own it. Now, I say that has been strained and there have been problems. And so one of the earliest acts of the Scottish Parliament, Part 1 of the Land Reform Act 2003, put this on a statutory footing. So it said you have the right of responsible access, and responsible access is governed by a statutory code. So it contains things about walking on crops and dogs and all that kind of stuff. And so long as you're compliant with the code, you're exercising your right of access and compliant with the code, then you have that statutory right. And it's quite akin to the Scandinavian Allemansrätt, but it is essentially a statutory underpinning of what has been the de facto position in Scotland for a long, long time. So it is more politically difficult to do this in England, just because of the kind of history of property rights, but also because of frankly, the denser pattern of population as well. I mean, you know, that is a sort of reality in some parts of the country. But I really don't understand the critics of public access in England, because you look at Scotland, and we have densely populated areas as well, in the central belt and Glasgow and Edinburgh and all the rest of it. And by and large, again, there are exceptions, by and large, there are very, very few problems. And where there are problems, there are local access fora. There's provisions in the legislation to deal with problems. And what has been developed is a culture of responsible access, where those who take access, broadly speaking, respect the rights of those who own or occupy the land across which they're walking, and in turn, those who own and occupy land, broadly speaking, respect the rights of people to take access. And if you can create that culture, then that's 90% of the battle.
Thanks, Andy. Donna, back to you. There's an ever-growing list of questions.
Yeah, this one's quite an interesting one. How can communities get unused public land into common uses such as community food growing?
Start with Kate, I think.
Oh gosh, I'm not good on this really, but I mean one of the things that we have in this country is the law of adverse possession. So if you've acted as though you own a piece of land for 12 years and you kind of document that, you can then take on ownership. But if the rightful owner comes along and proves it, that they own it, then you know that's you have to give way. And we do encourage, you know, we do have some information about that on our website, because we say that particularly probably to parish councils actually, which mow bits of land, you know, and empty the litter bins and all that. So that's one way of doing it, but quite honestly, I don't know. I don't know really if there is an owner. You know, it's all a question of negotiation, isn't it? I have no secret answer to that, I'm afraid.
Okay, Laurie or Andy, either of you want to come in on that at all? Just to give me a wink. Andy?
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, obviously, if you say unused public land, then the implication there is that you know the land is owned by a public authority. Okay, so the assumption there is you know it's owned by a public authority. We're not talking about unused, unknown ownership land. The first thing to say is engage the public authority. I mean, public authorities have got various statutory duties, from local authorities to the Forestry Commission to all sorts of other public authorities who own land. And by and large, those statutory duties do preclude just holding land and doing nothing with it. That's not deemed to be a good reason, and government, you know, occasionally has audits and all the rest of it, and encourages health boards and local authorities, etc., to use it or lose it. You know, get rid of land you're not using because it's a liability. So the first thing to do is to engage with the public authority and see if one can negotiate it. Now, if it's a national public authority, one can go through the local authority and try and put pressure on them. So yeah, that's the main way. I mean, that's how our democratic system is meant to work. I mean, in Scotland, we've got a law on asset transfer, for example. So you can make an application under law to a public authority to transfer an asset to a community body, and that the criteria under which that can be done include things like the public authority has no use for it, etc., etc. So there are kind of potential legal remedies here, but the main one is democratic. You know, put pressure on the public authority.
Thanks, Andy. Donna, another question, please.
Yeah, okay, here we go. We've not yet touched on repurposing commercial/office units and using brownfield sites for affordable housing, and ensuring this should be made the first focus before resorting to greenfield sites. Okay,
let's direct that one to Laurie, I think, to start with. So it's the question of brownfield first. Do you want to speak on that?
Yeah, no, good question. I think, you know, the question of, you know, commercial office units in particular, in light of the pandemic as well, where we do have a lot of office space that is, at least, you know, anecdotally, I see unused on the market. And I think this comes back to what I was saying earlier, in my view, whereas before we talk about building 300,000 homes a year, the question of sort of distribution, but also in terms of existing properties, existing structures, and looking at currently used as commercial office and converting that into, you know, for example, affordable social housing, for example, is something which I think, you know, absolutely should and could be talked about much more. And indeed, you know, it can be an effective way of doing that without, as I say, having to build new houses, and all the issues with that, including, of course, the carbon budget one. So yeah, I mean, I think in light of the pandemic, now is probably a good time to be talking about that. And I think the questions around, obviously, the ways that you do that, and one thing I think it's really important that we don't do is go down the sort of route of simply sort of liberalizing planning rules in order to, you know, enable this to happen quickly in a way without much scrutiny. We've had the whole issue with permitted development rights, for example. You know, we want to do this in a way which is ensuring that it's delivering kind of high quality, affordable housing that we want, not create opportunities for those who are minded to come along and sort of convert what were commercial offices into, you know, sort of modern slum dwellings, if you like, without the appropriate standards, etc. in place. And so I think there's a question as to what's the best way to do this, and who should be doing it. But yeah, I think it's absolutely a good question, and one we should be very much talking about.
Thanks, Laurie. Donna, let's try and get another question in before we have to finish.
Yeah, this is a good one. I've gone a bit further back in the chat here to pick this one out, but so somebody has said there will always be some land that is not registered as there is no identifiable owner and will not be. A good example is the land on which private roads serving suburban houses and their verges are laid out. The homeowners who use and share the maintenance of these roads and verges do not want the liability of actual ownership.
Okay, so unregistered land or land where it's difficult to find the owner. Is this a major problem?
Well, it's not. I don't think I'm probably the person to answer this because I don't really, haven't really come across it. I mean, there is, again, the adverse possession point I made, and you know, roadside verges, for instance, of private roads, which are not public, might well be land, you know, that one kind of wants to try and get hold of and take over, but things that are private are not always private, and we are involved in a lot of research at the moment for historic ways that are unrecorded, public ways that are unrecorded, to see if there's evidence that they should actually be shown on the definitive maps. And the Ramblers in particular and British Shore Society are pioneering a lot of work on this to record unrecorded rights of way.
And are you finding that we're losing the rights of way that we have increasingly, or is that a growing problem in terms of?
If they're unrecorded, then we certainly are losing them. In 1949, National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act set up the definitive map of rights of way, but it's never been complete. And the rule is that everything that is on it is a public highway, but there's a great deal that's not on it, which is also a public highway. But if it's not recorded, nobody knows it's there, so development will just, you know, be built over it. So those are at risk all the time, which is why we're very anxious to get them recorded. And the government did have a deadline for that recording, which it's now going to revoke, which is very good. But we're still carrying on with that. I mean, other paths, you can't just, supposedly you can't just build everything. If they're recorded on the definitive map, you have to go through a process of diverting them or formal extinguishment. But I mean, paths are being mucked about with all the time, and one of the things that our organisation does, you know, try and protect them on their old historic roots, because they are part of our history. You know, they are the kind of lifelines of the countryside, our rights of way. So important.
Thanks, Kate. Andy, I think last word to you. I mean, you've pioneered the sort of mapping of land ownership, which in itself is a major problem to find out who owns what, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, obviously the situation in different jurisdictions in the UK is different. There's 3 jurisdictions: Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. But really, if I mean, a typical housing developer who buys, say, a large field, and builds houses, will then want to divest themselves at the end of everything. They want to walk away. They want to be left with any liabilities. So unless they make provision in the titles of the new houses to you know, they will be selling those new houses, because the housing developer has bought the field. They're the owner of that house until they sell it to somebody. Unless they make provision that all the common parts, which will be grassy areas and roads and all the rest of it, are to be owned in common by the homeowners, in which case they do own all the common parts and have those responsibilities. If they don't make that provision, typically it falls to the local authority, who adopt the roads and open spaces. Now, historically, and this may be different in different jurisdictions, I don't know, but certainly in Scotland, historically, local authorities have become increasingly reluctant to adopt these new housing developments, because they don't want the liabilities of more miles of roads to maintain. So the housing developers have passed them on. In fact, they've retained them, but then they've passed them on to a series of companies and put conditions in people's titles that say they must pay money to maintain these. And you get these all sorts of shadowy organisations coming along, charging homeowners hundreds of pounds a year for doing next to nothing. So it's something that really should be sorted out right at the beginning. I mean, buyer beware. If you're going to buy a house, examine carefully the title deeds to see what responsibilities you have and what you don't have. On the broader point, of course, of unregistered land, England has a very modern land register, and there's a lot of land that is not registered. So in the Second World War, a lot of landowners, their only protection was to send their title deeds to Swiss bank vaults. We've had a land register with a small L and R since 1617. So 99.99% of land in Scotland is registered either in the old deeds register or the modern land register. So it's quite unusual to have unregistered, as it were, land. It's not unusual to have unowned land, because when a company goes bankrupt and is dissolved and ceases to exist, the land becomes owned by owned by now the King's and Lord Treasurer's Remembrancer in the Crown Office in Scotland. It falls to the Crown, and I think that's the same issue in England as well. It falls to the Crown. So yes, but buyers beware. In modern housing developments, you can get fleeced. It's just, and it's one of the big things here that people in Britain, their biggest investment in life is buying a house, and they just trust everyone in the chain that it's all going to be okay, without saying, I want to see the title deeds. Please tell me what these mean. What are my liabilities? Where's my boundary really going to? You know, it's genuinely frustrating. And as an MSP, I had these constituents who'd come complaining about it. I said, well, why did you buy it with those conditions? You know, and of course they just bought it because they assumed everything was going to be okay. Tough lesson.
Thanks very much, Andy. Okay, I think we've come really to the end of our programme, and I'm sorry to everybody who's asked a question in the chat and we haven't got round to you. Donna, you usually manage to copy the chat and to pass that out when we're
Yes.
distributing the video.
I can certainly do that, no problem.
Brilliant. So there's an awful lot of information as well as questions in the chat. That's really useful. And that's the, you know, I really want to thank everybody you're not the audience, you're our participants, and you've made this webinar a fantastic resource in itself. I'd like to thank our community organisations, Planning Democracy and the Community Planning Alliance, and Leeds Beckett University is providing these webinars to support community organisations involved in planning engagement. And to thank our speakers, wonderful speakers. Thank you so much, Kate, for joining us. Laurie, wonderful to hear you. And Andy, thank you very much for your work. And thank you all very much indeed for joining us this afternoon. Goodbye now.
Bye.